The air in Washington, D.C. shimmered with anticipation. It was one of those rare days where history didn't just knock, it kicked the door wide open. The National Mall, a corridor of monuments and memory, stood blanketed with a sea of people. Journalists elbowed for position, camera crews formed barricades of blinking lights, and everywhere thousands of phones floated above heads, hungry to capture the moment that was about to define a new era. At the heart of this expectation were two men, Pope Leo XIV, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., heir to a legacy and the face of a movement that had fractured traditional American politics. Today, they were scheduled to meet on neutral ground at the Global Unity Summit, a gathering that drew leaders from faiths, nations, and philosophies into one symbolic display of reconciliation and common cause. The crowd stirred. The Pope's motorcade had arrived. He stepped out, dressed not just in papal white, but in the weight of centuries. Pope Leo XIV was no ordinary pontiff. His papacy had been marked by controversy and courage, defending climate science from the pulpit, washing the feet of refugees, and challenging systems of power, both sacred and secular. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a provocateur. As he moved down the carpeted path, pausing to clasp hands and offer smiles, the moment drew closer. RFK Jr. stood waiting near the platform. Clad in a tailored navy suit, he exuded the composed intensity of a man who had long lived in the shadow of great men and was now determined to cast one of his own. His critics called him reckless. His followers called him righteous. But today titles meant little. All eyes were on the space between him and the Pope, and what would unfold in it. Suddenly, Pope Leo XIV was only a few feet away. The cameras zoomed, security tensed. The moment had come. And then, without a single word, the Pope turned. Not a stumble, not a distraction. He looked directly past RFK Jr., his gaze fixed elsewhere, and stepped toward the next figure in line, a representative from Norway's Environmental Council. He extended his hand, smiled, and walked on. Silence. A thunderous, bone-deep silence, the kind that doesn't come from the absence of noise, but from the collective gasp of thousands trying to process what they just witnessed. RFK Jr. didn't flinch. His eyes followed the Pope's movement, unreadable. Around him, murmurs rippled like aftershocks. Phones stopped recording. Commentators on live feeds stammered. This wasn't a handshake delayed. It was a moment denied. If you're stunned by what just happened, hit subscribe to follow every twist in this astonishing true story. Some in the crowd thought it was an accident. Others felt the chill of deliberate intention. What had happened? Why had the Pope, a man known for crossing lines, building bridges, chosen to ignore one of the most talked-about figures in modern America at such a symbolic gathering? What did it mean? More importantly, what would happen next? As the crowd stood in a fragile silence, one thing was certain. A quiet storm had just begun to gather over the National Mall, and the whole world was about to get caught in it. Long before the world stood frozen in that moment of silence, the roads that led Pope Leo XIV and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to the Global Unity Summit were already charged with history, conviction, and contradiction. Neither man arrived at the National Mall by accident. Their meeting, or lack thereof, was the culmination of two lifetimes shaped by resistance, belief, and divergent calls to leadership. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was born into America's most tragic dynasty. His father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., was a senator gunned down in his prime, and his uncle, President John F. Kennedy was lost to an assassin's bullet years before. From childhood, RFK Jr. bore the weight of legacy like a second skin. He could have walked away from public life entirely. Instead, he forged a path that would set him apart and at odds with the very system his family once commanded. As a young man, he battled addiction and grief, but from that fire emerged a fierce environmental crusader. He took on industrial polluters in court, challenged corporate giants, and became a relentless advocate for clean water and ecological justice. Later, his voice would evolve into something broader, more defiant. He questioned vaccines, condemned government overreach, and championed the rights of the individual over the state. To some, he became a hero of liberty. To others, a voice of dangerous misinformation. But no one denied the power of his words or the reach of his message. Pope Leo XIV's journey was no less remarkable. Born Mateo Salazar in Buenos Aires, he came of age under a military dictatorship that tortured dissenters and disappeared thousands. He studied theology in secret, guided by priests who whispered gospel truths under threat of death. The brutality of that time forged in him a belief that faith must never serve power. It must challenge it. When he rose to prominence in the church, he did so with a vow to lift the voices of the voiceless. As cardinal, and later as pope, he railed against corruption, climate denial, and clerical abuse. He refused opulence, lived simply, and spoke with piercing clarity. He washed the feet of prisoners, blessed refugees, and held climate talks at the Vatican. But his boldness also attracted enemies. Traditionalists called him reckless. Nationalist leaders bristled at his rebukes. He never flinched. So when the Global Unity Summit was announced, their attendance triggered speculation worldwide. Could two men with such potent histories, such powerful followings, find common ground? In the months leading up to the summit, that question became more than academic. RFK Jr., deep into his presidential campaign, released a public letter to Pope Leo XIV. In it, he praised the Pope's moral courage, but challenged him to confront what RFK Jr. called the growing shadow of global authoritarianism disguised as virtue. He invited dialogue on liberty, conscience, and the sacred bond between humanity and nature. The letter made waves. Supporters hailed it as a visionary olive branch. Critics called it a provocation. The Vatican offered no reply, but tensions simmered behind the scenes. Papal advisors were said to be wary of RFK Jr.'s rhetoric, fearing it undermined public health and collective responsibility. The Pope, true to form, remained silent. Yet the stage had been set. Their paths, shaped by struggle and fueled by passion, were destined to cross. Or so the world believed. Now, with the summit underway and the crowd still grappling with the meaning of that quiet snub, the question lingers like smoke. How did two men who seemed destined to meet fail to touch hands? The Global Unity Summit began with all the orchestration of a diplomatic masterpiece. Banners fluttered across the National Mall. Delegations from every continent filled the rows with their distinct colors and flags. The world had come to witness harmony in action, a choreography of ideals. Hope, unity, and a shared future echoed through every speech, every symbolic gesture. By mid-morning, the voices of global leaders had already filled the air with calls for cooperation. The Secretary-General of the UN spoke passionately about the climate crisis. A Nobel laureate from Ghana called for universal access to education. The Dalai Lama sent a message from his monastery, urging compassion above all else. The crowd applauded. The atmosphere was optimistic. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. took the podium, there was a noticeable shift in energy. Unlike the others, he did not begin with scripted niceties. He spoke from the gut. His words cut through the diplomatic fog with fire. "We talk of unity," he said, "but unity built on silence is not peace. It is obedience. And obedience is not the same as truth." There were pauses in his delivery, not from hesitation, but from calculated emphasis. He spoke of freedom of thought, the sacred duty of dissent, and the danger of allowing global institutions to decide the limits of human autonomy. He referenced his father, his uncle, and the long line of Americans who challenged consensus in the name of conscience. He closed with a plea: "Let us unite not by agreement but by understanding. That is the only honest peace." The applause was mixed. Some stood, some hesitated, others whispered, and then a wave of movement signaled the arrival of the man many had waited hours to see. Pope Leo XIV entered through the east approach, surrounded by aides and local clergy. His walk was steady, almost meditative. Though the heat of the day bore down on the marble and the masses, he moved as if untouched. His face bore the calm of a man who had walked through revolutions and funerals, through scandal and sanctity. As he approached the greeting line, every eye in the field turned toward him. RFK Jr. stood near the edge of the delegation, just ahead of several European dignitaries. Their positions had been arranged days before. Protocol demanded precision. The handshake between the Pope and RFK Jr. was to be brief, symbolic, but powerful. A nod to their shared concern for nature, for humanity, for the tension between old power and new protest. But something else happened. As the Pope drew within a few feet, he slowed. His eyes, often warm, turned unreadable. He looked directly toward RFK Jr., then, almost imperceptibly, shifted his gaze to the side. Without a word, without a pause, he turned his body and extended his hand to a guest standing next to RFK Jr. The moment passed in 3 seconds, but it struck like thunder. RFK Jr. remained perfectly still, his expression neutral, not a flicker of surprise, not a twitch of emotion. The crowd, however, couldn't hold its reaction. A gasp, then silence. Thick, heavy, awkward silence. The kind that wraps around the lungs and refuses to let go. People looked at each other. Was it intentional? Did they miss something? Cameras captured every angle. Social media lit up. News anchors stumbled over their commentary, trying to decode an action that spoke louder than 100 sermons. No one knew what had just happened, but everyone felt it. And in that silence, something had been said. Something irreversible. In the hours following the encounter, or lack thereof, the world reacted with the speed of lightning and the weight of centuries. The footage of Pope Leo XIV walking past Robert F. Kennedy Jr. without acknowledgement was dissected frame by frame across every major news network. Social media exploded. Analysts scrambled for context, while headlines circled the globe like a storm surge. Initial statements from Vatican representatives were carefully measured. One senior aide described the moment as logistically unfortunate, suggesting that the Pope had simply followed the order of protocol and may not have realized RFK Jr. stood in line. But the video told a different story. The Pope had looked directly at him. Their eyes had met. There had been a beat, silent, deliberate, before the Pope chose to move on. That beat changed everything. RFK Jr. himself remained silent for nearly 2 days. His campaign issued no comment. His official social media accounts went dark. The still image of him standing untouched, expression unreadable, circulated like a relic of a moment too loaded for language. Behind closed doors, tension crackled. Some Vatican insiders were reportedly alarmed at the Pope's decision, fearing that even if it had been spontaneous, its symbolism was too potent to control. Others, including those close to Pope Leo XIV, argued that the gesture was neither random nor careless, that it was in fact a message cloaked in restraint. In the media, the story evolved from curiosity to crisis. Cable pundits and faith leaders lined up to interpret the silence. Was it a snub rooted in politics, a moral stance, or simply a human reaction from a spiritual leader burdened by complex allegiances? The interpretations reflected deeper divisions. In Europe, especially in Germany and France, many saw the Pope's decision as a rejection of rising nationalist movements. Opinion pieces praised his unwillingness to lend credibility to populist figures with polarizing platforms. "A handshake is not neutrality," wrote one columnist. "It is consent, and silence when timed with precision becomes resistance." In Latin America, reactions were more cautious but no less passionate. Some admired the Pope's discretion, others criticized the missed opportunity for bridge building. "If not now," wrote a Brazilian theologian, "when? If not between faith and conscience, then where?" In the United States, reactions split down the seams of ideology. Progressive voices applauded the Pope for holding the line against what they viewed as a dangerous distortion of truth and science. Conservative and libertarian circles, however, erupted with outrage. They accused the pontiff of arrogance, of playing political games at a summit meant for healing. Hashtags trended, petitions circulated, talk radio ignited. Finally, on the evening of the second day, RFK Jr. broke his silence. In a live-streamed message from his home in Los Angeles, he addressed the moment directly. "I grew up believing in the sacredness of dialogue," he began. My family taught me that disagreement does not mean enmity, that silence can be powerful, but so can presence. He paused, then continued with measured grace. I don't know why the Pope chose to walk past me. I respect his journey. Mine is different. But we both want a world worth fighting for. The tone was firm, not wounded. It neither condemned nor praised, but its impact was immediate. Supporters hailed his restraint as presidential. Critics saw it as calculated. The world had witnessed a gesture, and in its wake, the ripple effects reached every corner. And still, one question remained. What would be remembered more? The silence itself or the meanings we gave to it? Days turned into weeks, yet the memory of that quiet moment at the Global Unity Summit refused to fade. It replayed endlessly in minds and media alike, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. In a world saturated with noise, a deliberate silence had stolen the spotlight and carved itself into the global consciousness. Speculations softened into something more introspective. Historians, sociologists, theologians, each offered their lens. Some framed the Pope's gesture as a necessary boundary, a refusal to legitimize ideas he believed endangered the vulnerable. Others framed it as a missed opportunity, a wound left open in an age starving for reconciliation. Then, unexpectedly, Pope Leo XIV released a brief statement. Not through a press conference, not from the Vatican's ornate balcony, but through a simple parchment posted on the Vatican's website under the heading, On Gestures and Grace. It read, "To listen is not always to speak, to love is not always to touch. The power of presence is measured not in applause, but in conscience. What we do not say is sometimes the most faithful sermon. Let the silence echo until it teaches." The message was cryptic but unmistakably poetic. It didn't address RFK Jr. directly. It didn't confirm or deny intention. But it confirmed what many already suspected. There was meaning in that moment, even if it would never be fully explained. Reaction was swift. For some, the Pope's words were a validation, a serene assertion of moral leadership in a fractured world. For others, it was confirmation of aloofness, a refusal to engage in hard, honest conversation. Yet in both camps, something shifted. The frenzy dulled into reflection. Commentators moved on, but the people didn't forget. College courses began analyzing the silence as a modern parable. Church sermons wove it into lessons on humility and discernment. Youth groups used it to discuss activism and respect. Memes still circulated, some mocking, some reverent, but even they carried the weight of unresolved tension. As for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the moment became a defining thread in his narrative. It appeared in campaign speeches not as grievance but as a symbol. He spoke of it as a lesson in restraint, in the courage to hold composure when misunderstood. The loudest truths, he told a crowd in Philadelphia, aren't shouted, they're endured. In the end, what the world witnessed was not merely a political anomaly or a papal oversight. It was a collision between two philosophies, one rooted in hierarchy, tradition, and symbolic clarity, the other in disruption, defiance, and the power of the individual voice. And the crowd that had once stood stunned in silence now stood wiser. They understood that unity was never simple, that gestures carried shadows, and that sometimes the loudest statement was the one never spoken aloud. The legacy of that moment won't be archived by what was said on podiums, but by what it stirred in hearts around the globe. History may debate the meaning forever, but history will not forget. History is full of quiet revolutions. Subscribe to stay on top of the ones unfolding now. And don't miss the next chapter. Click the video on your screen to continue this incredible story.